In the first segment of our Ocheesee Pond Wildman Mystery series, we told you about the 1884 capture of what locals called a wild man, or hairy man, in northwest Florida's Ocheesee Pond swamp. He was covered with hair, unintelligible, and no one knew who or what he was. In this segment, we will explore what happened to him. But first, did you know that he was not the only so-called wild man captured in the Ocheesee Pond swamp? That's right, a second party captured another one decades later. Plus, yet a third group found a massive skeleton high up in the trees of the swamp. Those stories are coming in our third and final segment. But first, on with the story of the original Ocheesee Pond wild man. Brought out of the swamp in the hot summer of 1884, the hair-covered creature, or human, or whatever he was carried 13 miles northeast to the town of Chattahoochee and today's Florida State Hospital. The mental health facility was then called the State Asylum for the Indigent Insane. It originally served as the Apalachicola Arsenal, a military facility, and later as Florida's first state prison.
They thought perhaps it was someone who had escaped from there. That turned out not to be the case. According to the people in the area, they didn't know what to do then, so what else would you do? They took it to Tallahassee and took him to the governor to see if the governor knew what to do about it. The governor obviously did not want this creature or human or whatever he was in his office, so he sent him right back to Chattahoochee, to where the state hospital was. And the last trace of him was at the state hospital. We looked through the cemetery burial records, and there are records of a number of unidentified individuals who died and were buried at the state hospital.
Those records show that the original wild man died at the asylum in 1885. According to Cox, patients who died at the facility at the time of the wild man's residence and death likely were buried in what has been labeled Cemetery Number 1. This was the same cemetery used when the facility was a state prison. Records indicate that bodies were buried in neat wood coffins. Administrators from the time of the wild man's death also report that they adopted at what first glance might seem an unusual custom. They buried the dead after dark.
Burying the dead after dark is practiced not only by the management here, but in many other similar institutions, because we wish to save our living patients the gloom of seeing corpses carried out before their eyes in daylight. Superintendent J.W. Tramwell, February 1896.
The obvious question is, could the body of the wild man be exhumed and tested to find out if it was human or the body of a real Bigfoot? The answer? It is highly unlikely. At least 579 people died at the asylum before 1897. In fact, when archaeologists from the Shikora Foundation were tasked with locating those graves in 2011, they ran into a huge problem. They only found 24 of them. Hospital structures and later the River Junction Correctional Facility were built over Cemetery Number 1, the burial ground used between 1873 and 1897. State archaeologist B. Calvin Jones found 6 skeletons adjacent to a building there in 1978 and learned that 8 others had been uncovered in the 1950s. The Shikora Foundation found 5 cemeteries with thousands of graves on hospital property, including a 50 by 50 foot area of Cemetery 1. They did not find the area where the patients were buried in 1877 to 1897, the years in which the wild man lived and died. Curiously, the Foundation learned that the Florida Division of Historical Resources actually curated a small collection of bones from that cemetery as late as 2011. Upon examination of those bones, it was impossible to determine the racial ancestry of the individuals that they came from. So, what happened to the body of the wild man of Ocheesee Pond? And the 554 other patients missing with him? The answer probably rests beneath one of the buildings that now stand on the hospital campus. But the mystery of Ocheesee Pond does not end there. In fact, local residents and newspaper accounts tell of at least 2 more cases of wild or hairy men, or their remains, in these swamps. We will break that news in our third and final segment of the Ocheesee Pond Wild Man Mystery. At Ocheesee Pond in Northwest Florida, I'm Rachel Conrad for 2 Egg TV.